Chapter 5 of Exposing the Expositions, narrated by author Howdy McCoskey. From Nashville to St. Louis. While not specifically a World's Fair, Tennessee held a 6-month celebration to mark the 100th anniversary of statehood. The Tennessee Centennial Exposition was held in Nashville from May 1 until October 30, 1897, although the state's actual centennial occurred in 1896. This seems to happen a lot. Hold an anniversary the year after the anniversary should be. The Nashville Fair is unique for building an actual-sized replica of the Parthenon in Athens, as well as having a fairly large pyramid. At least the claim is they built them. Nashville had been given the name Athens of the South. I have found no specific information to fully explain why it had such a nickname. One suggestion how the city got its Athens title was because it was the first American city to have a public school system. A bit of a cop-out explanation. Nashville had been a place of the famous Mississippian Indian tribes, they of the mound-building culture. Many mounds were supposed to have existed here, destroyed in order to build the city. Becoming the state capital in the 1840s, they began to build such things as the state capitol building still in use, looking like a Greek Ionic temple. It was claimed to be built by William Strickland of Philadelphia, and who was supposed to be buried within the walls of this Capitol building. Something sounds very odd about the story immediately. Then there is the Fisk University building, supposedly built in 1866, and looks as though it should be in the street corner of Prague. Or how about the column buildings of Belmont University? Also, perhaps, the buildings claimed to be at the Exposition. This is one of the great indicators to me as why Nashville was given the name Athens of the South. It was. There is more evidence that southern USA, prior to the European influx, was covered with buildings that would fit right in with ancient Rome or ancient Greece. The Exposition in Nashville presented the Commerce Building, 256 by 591 feet, and the Agricultural Building, 200 feet by 525 feet. The Children's Building also housed a model kindergarten, which met throughout the fair season and allowed fairgoers to see this relatively novel form of education. The Negro Building told the story of achievement under obstacles often seemingly impossible to overcome. The History Building was modeled on the Rheticon, another ancient Athenian temple. Memphis, yes, the city that has the name of Egyptian Old Kingdom capital, built a pyramid as its exhibit. And the entire fairground seemed to have been surrounded by what looked to be the remains of a giant star fort. But it was the Parthenon reproduction, also known as the Fine Arts Building, that got most of the attention. It was designed by Confederate veteran William Crawford Smith. It is claimed that the building, like all the others at the fair, were built of temporary materials, but, and this is a direct quote from the Wikipedia page, and it seems to come from Wilbur Creighton's book, The Parthenon in Nashville. The Parthenon was not intended to be permanent, but the cost of demolishing the structure, combined with its popularity with residents and visitors alike, resulted it in being left standing after the Exposition. End quote. So let's get this straight. The story being presented is that all of the buildings were temporary, including the Parthenon. However, to tear down the Parthenon was going to be too costly, so they left it standing and refurbished it in 1920 with more long-standing materials, i.e. stone. But what about the cost to tear down the Commerce Building, or the Agricultural Building, or all the others? They should have cost even more to tear down. But the one that looks like the Parthenon is too costly. That is as big a lie as one can present, and the reason I've been writing this book. I'm not giving a definite answer as to what or if anything was built in 1897. What I'm saying is that we need to do a much more thorough examination of stories such as this. One other building from the fair that is still standing is the Knights of Pythias Pavilion, which was moved to Franklin, Tennessee. Why were these the only two buildings too costly to tear down? Can we come close to finding out what is true? Omaha, 1898. The Trans-Mississippian Exposition was in Omaha's Kunst Park in 1898 on a 180-acre site, again with lagoons, gondolas, and over 21 massive buildings, for a place that also called itself a white city. Over 2.6 million people attended. The first question is, where did they all come from? Omaha was a very small city in 1898, and the American West had just opened up. That's a lot of people at the time. The origin story of the fair claims that in 1895, Omaha banker Gordon Wattles wanted to have a World Fair in Omaha. William Jennings Bryan was a key factor in getting the fair to Omaha. He, of course, was the one who later was the main attorney on the side of Bible in the Scopes Monkey trial in 1926. It apparently took 2 years just to locate a site, which meant they had but 1 year to build the entire fair. Its purpose was supposed to show off the development of the American West, and though not specifically stated, to show the inferiority of the native Indian and their primitive way of life. The native Indian villages were called a living display by the expo organizers. A modern documentary on the fair claimed it was to showcase that the United States could take a lead in civilizing the world. There are photographs of the construction of the fair buildings. Many are similar to the photographs we see elsewhere. What does look like the creation of a temporary structure being put up with a wood interior. But there are many others which depict a complete lower building, with the only building taking place adding a tower or a dome. It is hard to tell what may have been temporary and what was original. That may be the point with all of these fairs. You might have had 4 or 5 originals, and by the time you throw up 50 other temporary buildings alongside them and get painted with the same overlay, it would be almost impossible to tell one from the other. The main area was called the Grand Court, surrounded by magnificent Greco-Roman buildings with towers, domes, and columns, again showcased with whitewashed painting. Yet this expo is remembered mostly for its Indian Congress, which ran from August 4th to October 31. Beyond just having a zoo to display the natives, here the fair organizers originally wanted to have the largest gathering of Indian tribes since the whites first arrived. The idea was that the 500 members of 35 different tribes, including Apache Chief Geronimo, who was being held prisoner in Fort Still, were to be there to have open lectures and discussions that could be attended. This was to present the daily life, beliefs, and history of as many tribes as possible, with a key element being the native view of being connected with nature. This was without question one of the most progressive ideas that any of the fairs came up with, to present the actual teachings of the native peoples from their own mouths. Congress gave over $100,000 for this Congress and was managed by ethnologist James Mooney. Thousands of portraits of the natives were taken, with many of the most famous coming from here. However, when you look at the original collection, most native portraits were 2 views, one face on, the other side profile. Thus they look like modern mugshots. However, once the exposition began, it was clear to the organizers that the white fairgoers were not interested in hearing what the Indians might have to say, and instead just wanted to see dances, games, and ceremonies. Soon promoters were influenced by the Improved Order of Redmen, a white fraternal organization, who called to have the Congress stop completely and instead show off battles between the whites and the Indians where the whites would always win. It underscored the message that the natives were a race on their way to extinction and thus needed to submit to white rule. A 5,000-seat grandstand was soon erected to have these fake battles. The other main activity demanded were reenactments of the ghost dance, which caused many concerns in the government given that the U.S. Army had just murdered hundreds of ghost dancers in 1890 at Wounded Knee. Thus the idea of an actual Congress where the various Indians shared their views were long forgotten, and instead this fair started what became the standard Western movie themes of the 1950s. Indians and their connection with nature were quickly seen as something not to focus on. One U.S. Senator claimed at the fair, "Miraculous is the growth of the Mississippi region. It will support a population of 25 million without taxing its resources to oblivion. Science will discover new applications for overcoming the obstacles of nature. The inventions of Edison will replenish the treasuries of the world with the gold of its mountain ranges, and the discoveries of Tesla may convert the wasteland winds and rivers into applied energy that will carry on all the operations of industry without the intervention of human labor." End quote. Yes, the wind and rivers are nothing but waste, and all nature but an obstacle. This is how the people thought then, and sadly many still think now. As this book is presenting, there was a time when no one thought like this, and people may have in fact lived in great harmony with the earth. There's an oddity I want to point out about the photographs of this fair. Most of them have original copyright dates directly on the photos. Generally, of course, they list 1898, the year of the fair. A few appear with the year 1897. However, there are photos with dates of years such as 1892, even 1858. The photo of the U.S. government building is the ones with the 1892 copyright date. Why is there an 1892 copyright on the photo? I don't think this is some sort of casual mistake. They took this copyright stuff seriously, even back then. Could we really be seeing the buildings photographed 8 years before the fair? So we really have to ask, just what year was this fair photographed? It's interesting to read the views of modern historians who discuss the speedy way the fair supposedly came up and didn't last. These are the typical quotes, such as, "But it was intentionally built cheap and temporary. This was the only way Omaha could afford such a spectacular place. To show the cheapness of the buildings at the Expo, in November 1898, the Nebraska building was sold for $470 to a new company. That amount in 2015 dollars, $12,819. These weren't well-built structures, and people knew it then, even if people today don't quite understand or accept that." End quote. Okay, that's the standard historical explanation for these fairs. As you know, so far I just don't believe that story. But this is what you come up with again and again, as if no historian is actually willing to take 10 minutes and think about what they're presenting from the standpoint of actual architecture and the building construction required. When the fair ended, they only demolished a few buildings and decided to have another smaller fair the following year. After the second fair, a railroad car packed with demolition equipment arrived on November 4, 1899. It took only until January 1900 to have basically demolished the entire thing. What wasn't demolished was, you guessed it, destroyed in a mysterious fire a few months later, June 1900. After that, there was again nothing left. Buffalo, 1901. Buffalo had a World's Fair in 1901. Yes, Buffalo. Okay, Buffalo did have the 8th largest population in the U.S. at the time, and did have proximity to both the tourist attractions of Niagara Falls and the closeness of New York City. But still, it's hard to place Buffalo in the same breath as Paris, London, Barcelona, Chicago, and the other World Fair hosts. Why is the city even named Buffalo? The origin for the name is in fact unknown. The standard claim is that the name is given after nearby Buffalo Creek. Okay, but then how did the creek get its name? There were no buffalo around this area where the Europeans supposedly arrived. One claim suggests that it comes from French fur traders calling the river Beau Fièvre, beautiful river, but I think that's a stretch. Some claim the creek was named long ago by Indians when buffalo were this far east. Other suggestions are equally odd. So in fact, no one has any idea why the city has the name Buffalo. All of its growth as a city is claimed to come from the building of the Erie Canal in 1825, which is another construction mystery when you examine it closely. Buffalo, like Chicago, has a number of old structures, churches, government buildings, hotels, and the like. Who built them in such a short period of time? Their Pan American Exposition was held in 1901 and also began on that famous May 1st date. It occupied a massive 350 acres and again was supposedly built of temporary structures, of which only a few survive, such as the current Buffalo History Museum. Several guidebooks were published for the fair, including Rand McNally. Anyone going there was said to be going to do the Pan. Many of the guides suggest the reader take a day or two and visit Toronto, Hamilton, and Niagara Falls, Canada. Thomas Edison shot much video at this fair, though it is grainy, which is interesting, as again the electricity of the fair was won by Nikola Tesla and Westinghouse. It was at this fair that U.S. President William McKinley was assassinated in the Temple of Music. His last speech before he was shot discussed that, quote, "Expositions are the timekeepers of progress. They record the world's advancement. They stimulate the energy, enterprise, and intellect of the people and quicken human genius. They go into the home. They broaden and brighten the daily life of the people. They open mighty storehouses of information to the student." End quote. McKinley at the time was very popular. The U.S. had just won the Spanish-American War and gained several territorial acquisitions from it. This fair was supposed to in some way glorify the new expansionist flavor that the U.S. had taken up. Pan-Americanism was the idea that the U.S. was to be in control of the Americas, North and South, and this was reflected on the logo for the fair. This logo had North and South America symbolized by two women whose dresses formed the shapes of the continents, while their hands joined over Central America. It was painted by Raphael Beck, who used two specially selected beauty contest winners, Maxine Elliott and Maud Coleman Woods, to model for it. Oddly, there may have been a second message in the logo besides the union of North and South America, for Elliott came from Maine, a key state in the Union of the Civil War, while Coleman Woods, called the most beautiful women in Virginia by the Daughters of Confederacy, was from a key southern state. When it comes to the construction photos, this is the hardest fair to find them. The Buffalo History Museum has a few, but they are very dubious. One above is just a guy standing inside one of the peristyle courts with no construction happening at all. The next page has the giant electrical tower. That looks like a pretty complete building to me. So far, no one has shown how the Great Tower, some 390 feet high, could be built out of some 2x4s and plaster. The photos of its demolition has the thing crashing into the ground like a falling jumbo jet. It looks as solid as can be on landing, not something made out of wood and lime hemp. Another photo of workers at the Buffalo History Museum have a group that look like laborers for sure, but they're all wearing painting smocks. So they're not building, they're painting. And the guys in front are obviously making it look like they're working. My guess is what we are seeing a lot at these fairs is the use of plaster, but plastering over already existing brick buildings. They would not only hide the original brickwork, but make it impossible to differentiate between the similar plastered over small wood structures that have been built beside it. Another theory that we'll put to the test in St. Louis is that much of the fair was there at the site, just not above ground. It was from such an old time that it had been covered with mud in the 100 years previous from what are called the mud floods. Thus, the work of the fair workers was not to construct the sites, but dig them out, repair as needed, plaster over top, and finally paint them. Voila, 350 acres of buildings go up in a few years. While Chicago was called the White City and Omaha the New White City, the buildings in Buffalo featured so much color, it was named the Rainbow City. Some 2,000 sculptures, some new and some historical, could be found on every part of the site. Huge buildings are again here, such as the manufacturers, liberal arts, machines, transportation, agriculture, and electrical buildings. Most buildings here were designed by what is called Spanish Renaissance style. The federal government building occupied the entire eastern esplanade of the Exposition and was 130 feet by 418 feet, connected by two colonnades to two annexes for fishery and agriculture, each 100 square feet. The total exhibition space inside was 75,000 square feet. The central dome was 250 feet high and topped by a 20-foot statue of Victory. The Temple of Music was 150 feet on each side, and the center dome rising to 180 feet, 53 feet 9 inches from the floor inside. The four major pieces of sculpture were on each corner of the building and were intended to symbolize the four categories of music. Inside there were 4 p.m. concerts, which had the largest organ in the United States, while at night seating for concerts was 2,200. The women's building was on the site previously and had been used as the Country Club of Buffalo for golf and polo. The New York State building, called the only building planned to be permanent, only because it happens to still be there, is now the Buffalo History Museum. The south side looks like the Parthenon in Athens. Above the columns are fine detailed sculpture. In the center of the fair was the 395-foot-high electrical tower. On top of the tower was a golden statue called the Goddess of Light, mirroring the golden statue in Chicago. One of the real oddities for me of this fair on the photographs is to see just how much electricity is being generated. All of the buildings are lit up like Christmas trees. Where's all this energy coming from? History claims that it comes again from Nikola Tesla. Walter Hines Page claimed at the time, "The tower is a great center of brilliancy. There are perhaps not 500,000 electrical bulbs, but there are hundreds and thousands of them, and if you're willing to believe that, there may be millions. It shines like diamonds, a transparent, soft structure of sunlight." End quote. Supposedly, electrical turbines were set up at Niagara Falls to bring power to the electrical building at the fairgrounds. But I would speculate that the giant electrical tower and the electrical building in front of the lagoon somehow connected the energy of water are likely the manufacturer of the energy for all the lights. What is more odd is when it comes to the electricity on display is that very few of the interiors of key buildings, such as the Exposition Hospital's operating room where President McKinley would be taken, had any lights. But for all the nice Roman buildings and pleasant-looking lagoons, this was a very strange fair. First is the Johnstown Flood Midway Concession, which was a very graphic presentation of the 1889 disaster in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, caused by a dam breaking and resulting in the loss of 2,200 lives. It cost 25 cents and ran every 30 minutes. An exhibit to show off a massive amount of deaths from a flood? And the May 4, 1901 edition of the Buffalo Times called this display wonderful. Why do I think this is important? Because I think this is really a description of what alternate historians refer to as the mud flood, a worldwide event, though not necessarily at the same moment of time, perhaps triggered by some sort of sound or energy weapon locally, that produced biblical floods and left cities covered in many feet of mud. Whether Johnstown itself had a dam burst, or whether that was just a story to explain the obvious flood damage from the event, I get the sense that this Johnstown exhibit was really there to symbolically reflect the worldwide destruction of the last 100 years, which will be further mentioned in the last chapter. It was okay if these expositions lost money, for they had a deeper purpose altogether, and that I feel that was sort of historical brainwashing. Native Indians were brought in again to have giant battles reenactments with the U.S. cavalry troops in a 12,000-seat stadium that was an imitation of the Colosseum of Rome. As for this structure, quote, built as a temporary structure, the enormous stadium became a topic of speculation as the exposition's closing neared. A few wanted it to remain as a permanent addition to the North Buffalo area, but it was owned by the Exposition Company and stood on leased land, and so there was no serious contemplation of preserving an all-wooden structure whose decorative features were covered with staff. Like the rest of the exposition buildings, it only appeared substantial. A news item from March 25, 1902 said, "The great stadium of the exposition has been attacked by the wreckers, and it will be laid low in a few days." End quotes. Further photos of the stadium show a great amount of what can only be called weathering, including what appears to be a type of mold growing on some of the walls. It seems like an awful lot of mold for a structure only supposed to be 1 year old. Look them up for yourself and try to explain that amount of weathering on a 1-year-old building. The battles were set up to be like watching a 1950s 1950s Western movie. Edison had some of it filmed, and when watching it, it seems to be lines of two sides firing shots at each other, but in no time does anyone pretend to die or be hurt. The Indians were there as part of showing off the defeated nations just destroyed by the U.S. Army. Teepees and exhibits were set up to show their primitive tools and primitive life to further present the great military power of the U.S. to defeat them and the great consumer goods that the eastern city people had that made them superior to the natives. Margaret Crichton wrote in her book, "The most shocking event of the fair was the public slaughter of 700 dogs, many taken from animal shelters or snatched off streets. It was held over 2 days in front of 20,000 spectators. The Indian Congress, made up of several tribes, carried out the executions with Geronimo on loan from an Oklahoma prison, killing the first dog with a bow and arrow. The dogs were then eaten." End quote. But the racism did not stop there. A popular part of the Midway was the old plantation. The Buffalo Evening News described it, and I quote the article exactly, "Genuine Southern darkies, 200 of them, ranging in years from wee toddling pinnies to Negroes gray and bent with age, can be seen each day at the exposition at their different occupations and pastimes. Lovers of Negro melodies will have a feast. Many of the darkies will be selected because of their special talents as singers and banjo players, and they will dance and sing to the seductive tinklings of instruments exactly as the Negroes of the South used to in the long, long ago." End quote. The Buffalo Express suggested, quote, "I'd like you to hear coon songs and dances and banjo music. Go to the old plantation and spend a very pleasant hour or so." End quote. You can find several photos on the net if you want to search. Look for Cakewalk and Old Plantation. Expos and racism seem to be tied together during this period. The Buffalo Exposition is most known for the shooting of President McKinley, twice in the stomach by Leon Kozolgaz in the Temple of Music on September 6. What was shocking about the aftermath was the hospital and operating area at the fair had no interior lighting, even though outside was 10,000 electrical lights. Supposedly, they had to hold up a mirror to reflect the rays of the sun for a local doctor, not trained in such surgeries, to do the operation. A nationwide hunt went out looking for any anarchist that might have been a friend of Kozolgaz. Anyone he had even spoken to for the past few weeks was arrested and held for questioning. Meanwhile, the news on the president that his health was continually improving until September 12th, when it was reported he was getting worse, when it's claimed he died on the 13th. The trial of Kozolgaz started on September 23rd, just 10 days after the death of the president, and lasted only 2 days. His two appointed attorneys basically argued nothing. They did not speak to the client and called no witnesses or testimony. He was quickly convicted and died in the electric chair on October 29, 1901, and then had acid poured over his body and was buried. Was this assassination similar to the Kennedy assassination? An inside job that was quickly covered up so that the choice of leader, here Theodore Roosevelt, could be in charge? The electric chair actually turned out to be a big part of this fair and is connected to the rivalry between Tesla and Edison. Edison had previously tried to show that Tesla's alternating current was dangerous and had staged public execution of animals, including dogs and a horse, using Tesla's technology. Edison was the first to use the electric chair on a prisoner, William Clemmer, at the Auburn, New York prison in 1890. Then, 11 years later, Edison was back at the same prison, helping with the Kazalgas execution. Edison went so far as to create a filmed reenactment of the execution so he could brand anything associated with electricity with his name. There's another attempt at execution at this fair. The Midway also had animals presented by Frank C. Bostock, the Animal King, a man of unbounded courage and resources before whom all animals cower, end quote. Sounds like a lovely man. But it gets worse. Bostock had recently acquired Jumbo, a 9-ton elephant from the British Army, where it had been decorated by Queen Victoria for bravery in the Afghanistan wars. So how did he treat the elephant? Bostock claimed that by the end of the fair, Jumbo had stopped eating and even tried to attack him. So he decided to have the elephant killed, and with a public execution at the fairgrounds, with tickets costing 50 cents. He said, "It's likely that Jumbo will be hanged or choked to death with chains." Opposition to the plan was immediate from the Buffalo mayor and all the fair organizers. The problem they had was not with the killing the elephant, but the methods used on the fairgrounds they would only allow it to go on if the elephant was electrocuted. Yes, electrocuted. Sunday, November 3, 7,000 people came to witness it. The elephant was set up to long electrical wires. Bostock gave a speech of Jumbo's military service and how his time in the Midway caused him to become a killer. But when the switch was pulled and the electricity shot through the elephant, Jumbo did not die. Quote, "The crowd almost spontaneously started to laugh, and Bostock, himself incredulous, promised over the din of the laughter that he would refund their tickets. Only later did he realize that Jumbo's hide had the effect of rubber and was impossible to penetrate. Jumbo's execution was stopped." These are the people who shaped our modern world. Slave exhibits, dog killings, electrocuting prized elephants, presidential assassinations. Oh, brave new world. With McKinley's assassination, the excitement of the fair all but died with him. On November 1, the day of closing, it was called Buffalo Day, with the hopes of drawing one last crowd. What happened by the evening was a riot. Quote, "People went mad. They seized with desire to destroy. Depredation and destruction were carried on in the boldest manner all along the Midway. Electric light bulbs were jerked from their posts and thousands of them were smashed on the ground. Some of the Midway restaurants were crushed into fragments under the pressure of the mob as if they were so much pasteboard. Windows were shattered and doors were kicked in. Policemen were pushed aside as if they were stuffed ornaments. The National Glass exhibit was completely destroyed. Pabst's Cafe was destroyed, and Cleopatra's Needle was torn to the ground." End quote. By 1902, the fair began to be destroyed by Harris Wrecking Company of Chicago. A local committee was formed to buy and preserve the electric tower as a lasting monument to the Exposition, but failed to raise the necessary funds. On January 20, the statue of the Goddess of Light was sold to Humphrey Popcorn Company of Cleveland, and the tower was finally torn down. I happened to be watching some YouTube clips of some people who filmed themselves exploring abandoned buildings. In one, they were visiting an old TB hospital asylum near Buffalo. The hospital, built in 1909, had a giant domed rotunda. Okay, that's strange. A comment on the video had me look into it, and yes, there's a connection to this fair. The hospital, J. N. Adam Memorial Hospital in Pennsburg, New York, was built between 1909 and 1912. It's huge. Unfortunately, I could not find one photo that could be described as public domain, so you're going to have to do a Google search yourself to see it. What is remarkable is that the beautiful glass on top of the dome is the very same piece of glass that was at the top of the Temple of Music at the Buffalo Fair. Yes, the very place where the president was assassinated. It is listing as having been donated as a gift to the hospital by Buffalo Mayor Adam. Huh? So the mayor kept the glass where the president was assassinated, obviously as some sort of trophy. I'm sure the group that had Kennedy killed has a number of souvenirs as well. So this hospital was started with the souvenir of the assassination. I just wanted to mention that when you look into the fairs, because parts of them will show up in the strangest places. A week after the fair was a report that it had lost $6 million and that the company would have to default on over $3.5 million in bonds. But Milburn claimed that the money spent was not foolish, that the Pan American was a masterpiece, and the city its chosen showcase. Yet Milburn did not stay long in Buffalo, for he left for New York in a partnership in a law firm. Yes, the Buffalo Fair was a money loser, had a president assassinated, racism presented in the most foul ways, and animals murdered. You would think that might be enough to stop the whole business of Expositions finally. But no, they decided the next one needed to be even bigger.